Grace Sullivan found him in the alley behind the bakery, face down in a pool of thick, black blood, his breathing broken and thin, like a candle about to be snuffed out in the middle of a storm. She should have turned away. She should have locked the door, called the police, and pretended she had never seen anything at all. That was the rule for surviving in this neighborhood, a place where curiosity could get you killed. But Grace was not someone who knew how to turn away. Without time to think, she dragged the unknown man inside, used a cheap first aid kit and an old bottle of vodka to dig the bullet out, buried deep near his ribs. Her hands were still dusted with flour, hands that had kneaded thousands of loaves, now stitching up a stranger's wound with sterilized silk thread she had kept from her university days. 3 years of medical school before she dropped out. 6 years of grinding work to pay hospital bills for her mother, wasting away from cancer. 27 years of life with the weight of an entire family on her shoulders, and now she was saving a man she did not even know. What Grace did not know was this. The dying man she had just pulled back from the edge was Vincent Caruso, the most powerful mafia boss in the city, the one who controlled half the underworld with blood and iron. And when the sun had barely risen, 50 luxury cars lined up in a long row in front of her tiny bakery. Shiny black Mercedes, silver Bentleys gleaming in the early light, armored SUVs that looked as if they were built for war. The whole street woke in stunned disbelief. Neighbors spilled out onto the sidewalk, whispering in a rising wave, and Grace stood frozen in the familiar smell of flour, realizing that her ordinary life had just ended. She had only wanted to save someone who was dying. She did not know that doing so would drag her into a war between gangs, would turn her into a target for enemies whose names she had never even heard. She did not know that her kindness would lead to an innocent person being burned alive, would lead to her younger brother being kidnapped, would lead to the entire neighborhood turning its back on her. And she knew even less that the cold man with eyes as dark as an abyss would change everything she had ever believed about good and evil, about love and sacrifice. Because in Vincent Caruso's world, there are no heroes. There are only people willing to stain their hands with blood to protect what they love. And Grace Sullivan, a baker with a heart too soft for a world too hard, is about to learn the most expensive lesson of her life. Sometimes saving one life means losing yourself. This is a story about kindness in the dark, about love that sprouts from a blood debt, and about a woman brave enough to stand between two worlds and change them both. If this story touched you, please leave a like as a thank you to the hearts that still know how to love. Share it with the friend who needs to hear this story tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, press it now, because the best stories are still waiting for you ahead. 15 minutes before Grace Sullivan dragged the unknown man into the bakery, she was standing at the old sink, scrubbing dried, stubborn flour from her forearms. The wall clock read 12:47 in the morning. Morrison's bakery lay under a blanket of silence, broken only by the steady hum of the industrial refrigerator and the lingering warmth rising from the oven that had just been shut off. Grace was so tired her eyes burned, but she could not go home yet. There were still 3 batches of sourdough to prepare for tomorrow morning, and Mr. Harry had trusted her with the key. She could not disappoint him, the only man who had given her a chance when the whole world had turned its back. The first bang cracked through the night, like someone slamming a metal trash can. Grace flinched, freezing with her hands still wet. The second, the third, the fourth followed in a ruthless burst, dry and sharp. She knew it was gunfire. 6 years in this industrial neighborhood had taught her how to tell the sound of violence apart. Fireworks carried a wide echo that lingered. Guns were different, brief, merciless, as if they were tearing the air itself. Grace's heart thrashed inside her chest. She shut off the tap, wiped her hands on her worn apron, and stood perfectly still in the dim kitchen, like a statue. Her survival instinct screamed in her head. Lock the door, turn off the lights, pretend no one is here. That was the unspoken rule for people living in the city's gray zone. Do not look, do not listen, do not know anything at all. The curious ones often ended up in body bags. But then came the distant screams, the frantic pound of running feet, and the sound of something heavy collapsing to the ground right behind the back door. Grace bit her lip until she tasted blood. She thought of her mother in the hospital, tangled in tubes and drip lines. She thought of Tommy, her 22-year-old brother, still naive enough to believe luck would come if he just bet hard enough. She thought of herself, 27 years old, exhausted, alone, with nothing but calloused hands and a heart too soft for this world. She should have turned away, but then she remembered her father, James Sullivan, the man who had fallen in the factory 6 years ago, who had died alone amid the roar of machines because no one could be bothered to call an ambulance. They said her father was only a worker, not worth stopping the production line. Grace opened the door. The weak light from the only street lamp still working spilled faintly into the alley, and she saw him, a man sprawled face down in a pool of blood. One hand clamped to his ribs, the other still gripping a gleaming black gun. The cloth mask that had covered half his face had slipped, revealing a sharp line of jaw and skin gone pale from blood loss. He lifted his head, and his eyes found her in the dark. There was no pleading in that look, no fear, the kind you expect from someone about to die, only surprise, as if he had not believed anyone would open a door for him. "Don't." His voice was raw, breaking with pain. "Don't call anyone." Grace did not answer. She lunged forward, seized his arm, and hauled him backward into the bakery. He was heavier than she expected, solid muscle beneath a blood-soaked dress shirt. But Grace was used to dragging sacks of flour that weighed 50 kilograms every day. She clenched her teeth, threw every ounce of strength into it, and at last pulled him over the threshold. She slammed the door shut, slid the bolt into place, and turned to look at the man gasping on the floor. "No police," he repeated, weaker now, but still carrying authority. "No hospital, no one." And ever. Grace dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she lifted his shirt to see the wound. Blood was still flowing, dark red, spreading in uneven stains. The bullet sat deep near his ribs, and she knew that if she did not act right away, this man would die on Mr. Harry's bakery floor. "You'll die if you don't go to a hospital," she said, her voice colder than she felt. "Better dead than that." He clenched his jaw, black eyes locked on hers. "Do it. I know you can." Its ability was. Grace did not understand how he knew. Maybe he had seen the way she studied the wound, the way she checked his pulse and pupils by instinct. 3 years of medical school had sunk into her bones, even though she had tried to forget. She rushed to the cabinet, yanked out the first aid kit and the bottle of vodka Mr. Harry kept hidden in a drawer. When she came back, the man had pulled the mask off completely. His face showed clearly under the kitchen light, younger than she had imagined, maybe around 36, with the cold beauty of a stone statue. Grace poured vodka over her hands, then over the wound. The man hissed between his teeth, but he did not cry out. She used tweezers to draw the bullet out, bit by bit, feeling the chill of the metal slide free from torn flesh. Blood surged, and she pressed gauze down, waited for it to slow, then began to stitch. The curved needle pierced skin and muscle. The thread pulled the edges of the wound toward each other. Grace worked in absolute silence, with only the man's heavy breathing and the frantic pounding of her own heart. By the time she tied the final knot, the man was nearly spent. His eyes drooped half shut, his lips drained of color, but his breathing had steadied. "You," he whispered, his voice as light as a passing breath. "What's your name?" Grace looked at the stranger, her hands still smeared with his blood, and wondered why she answered at all. "Grace. Grace Sullivan." His lips moved, repeating the name as if carving it into memory. "Grace." Something flickered through his deep black eyes, too fast for her to catch. "I won't forget." A channel. Then he passed out, and Grace sat there on the icy floor, staring at the stranger whose life she had just saved, not knowing that she had changed the course of her own fate forever. Grace could not sleep. She sat on the wooden chair beside the oven, her eyes never leaving the unknown man lying motionless behind the sacks of flour. She had dragged him into the darkest corner of the storeroom, covered him with a tarp, leaving only his pale face and the faint rise and fall of his chest exposed. Every time he breathed, Grace counted the rhythm in her mind, as if she feared that if she stopped counting, he would stop breathing too. The clock struck 2 a.m. when the man opened his eyes. Grace jolted to her feet, instinct driving her hand toward the rolling pin handle beside the chair. But he did not move. He only lay there and looked at her with deep black eyes, strangely alert for someone who had lost that much blood. "Water," he said, his voice rough. She hesitated for a second, then went to get a glass of water from the sink. When she knelt and lifted his head so he could drink, she felt the heat of his body through the fabric and realized he had a mild fever. Infection could set in at any moment with a wound like that, but she had no antibiotics. Nothing but cheap gauze and hope. The man drained the glass, then let his head fall back, his eyes still fixed on her. "Why?" he asked. Grace knew what he meant. Why she opened the door. Why she pulled him inside. Why she did not call the police the way any normal person would have. She had no answer. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Maybe because I'm an idiot." Something flickered in his eyes, too fast for her to catch what it was. Maybe surprise. Maybe something close to respect. "Most people would have left me to die," he said, his tone low and unhurried. either out of fear or out of greed, waiting for a reward. But you didn't. Ted, I don't know who you are. That's right. And that's what makes it different. Silence stretched between them. Grace sat down on the floor, her back against a flour sack, her eyes weighted by sleeplessness. She should have been afraid. She knew that. This man was clearly not an ordinary civilian. Not with the way he had been hunted, not with the gun, not with the strange calm he carried in the face of death. But somehow she could not be afraid of him. Maybe she was simply too tired to be afraid of anything anymore. You should rest, he said suddenly. I'm not tired. You're a terrible liar. Grace meant to argue, but at some point her eyes had already closed. She slipped into a fitful sleep, crowded with chaotic images of blood, of gunshots, of black eyes watching her in the dark. When she woke, dawnlight had slipped through the high window. The corner of the storeroom was empty. Grace sprang up, her heart hammering. The tarp was folded neatly. There was not a single smear of blood on the floor. She rushed to look around, but everything was clean, as if last night had been nothing but a dream. The blood-soaked bandages were gone. The vodka spilled on the floor had dried and been wiped away. Even the tweezers she had used to pull out the bullet had been washed and placed back in its proper spot inside the first aid kit. That man had done all of it while she slept. He had erased every trace, shielding her from anyone who might come looking, or shielding himself. Grace stood in the kitchen, feeling as though she had just woken from a nightmare she could not be sure had been real. Then she saw it, on the wooden table where she usually left her apron. A small black card lying perfectly still. She picked it up with trembling hands. The card was made from an expensive material, firm and smooth. No name, no address, only a string of numbers embossed in gold ink. A phone number. Grace stared at the card for a long time, then slipped it into her apron pocket. She did not know who that man was. She did not know why he had left his number behind. She only knew that last night, she had done something any sane person would call insane. And somehow, she had a feeling this was not the end. Grace went home just as the sun rose above the soot-gray rooftops of the industrial district. Her fourth-floor apartment sat in an aging building, where the elevator was broken more often than it worked, and the stairwell smelled of damp mold all year long. But it was home, the only place where she could close the door and pretend the outside world did not exist. She showered under cold water because the water heater had been broken since last week, scrubbing her hands until the skin turned raw and red, yet still feeling as if the stranger's blood clung to her. The black card lay on her bedside table, and she stared at it for 10 minutes before sliding it into a drawer, burying it beneath papers and unpaid hospital bills. She tried to sleep, but she could not. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw those deep black eyes again, heard the rough voice asking her name. Grace Sullivan. He had repeated it as if carving it into bone. It made her shiver, even though she did not understand why. The next morning, she got up at 6 as usual, drank a cup of coffee gone cold, and walked to the bakery. It was a routine that had sunk into her blood over 6 years, so deeply she could do it without thinking. Her feet carried her past Mrs. Nguyen's steamed bun shop, past the repair garage with its rusted sign, past the Patterson grocery where Margaret always waved at her every morning. But today Margaret did not wave. She stood in the doorway with her mouth hanging open, eyes fixed on the far end of the street. Grace slowed. Then she stopped. The little street, usually dotted with only a few battered cars, was now flooded with luxury vehicles lined up from the corner all the way to Morrison's bakery. Shiny black Mercedes, silver Bentleys glittering in the early sun, massive SUVs with windows so dark they looked like they had stepped out of a Hollywood action film. She counted at least 50, maybe more, arranged in 2 long rows like a wedding procession for the upper class. Neighbors poured outside, murmuring and whispering. Children pointed. Housewives spoke behind cupped hands. Even the young men who usually loitered on the corner stood still as statues, eyes wide, unable to believe what they were seeing. Grace's stomach dropped. She knew. Somehow, she knew this was because of her. She walked toward the bakery with legs that felt weighted with lead. The glass door stood wide open, and inside, Harry Morrison was behind the counter, his face as white as flour. He was 68, a man who had baked for 53 years, and now he trembled like a leaf in the wind. And sitting at the corner table, the one usually claimed by old men playing chess, was the man from last night, but he was no longer the dying figure on the kitchen floor. The man in front of her wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, so expensive Grace did not dare guess the price. His hair was slicked neatly back, his face clean-shaven, and his polished leather shoes looked as if they were worth her entire month's pay. 2 men dressed in black stood on either side like statues, their cold eyes sweeping the room without pause. Only the eyes were the same. Deep, black, piercing, fixed on her from the moment she stepped through the door. Grace stood frozen in the bakery, the familiar smell of butter and sugar mingling with something sharp and dangerous she could not name. The man rose, slowly and with quiet command, as if he had all day to wait. Last night's wound did not seem to touch him, or if it did, he hid it very well. "Grace Sullivan," he said, his low voice filling the sudden silence. Harry made a strangled sound in his throat. She turned toward him and saw the old man's eyes widened in terror. "Do you know?" he whispered, his voice shaking so badly Grace had to strain to hear it. "Who that is?" She shook her head, though understanding was beginning to form inside her. "Vincent Caruso." Harry said the name as if reading out a death sentence. "He controls half this city. The whole underworld is in his hands." Grace turned back to the man walking toward her, each step steady and sure on the worn wooden floor. Last night, she had pulled a bullet from his ribs. She had stitched him up with ordinary thread and cheap vodka. She had saved his life without having the faintest idea who she was saving. And now the most powerful mafia boss in the city stood in front of her, inside a tiny bakery that smelled of yeast and flour, with 50 luxury cars waiting outside and the entire neighborhood holding its breath. "We need to talk," Vincent Caruso said, and it was not an offer. Vincent Caruso walked up to the pastry counter with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He pulled a thick wad of cash from the inside pocket of his suit and set it down on the glass, right beside the neat rows of croissants and crescent rolls. $5,000 in crisp bills, bright green and brand new, stacked high like a declaration. "All the pastries in the shop," he said, as casually as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. "Every loaf of bread, every cake, every cookie. I'm buying it all. Keep the change." Grace looked at the money, then up at the cold face of the man in front of her. Last night she had seen him at his weakest, lying in his own blood, begging her not to call anyone, but the man standing here now held none of that weakness. Power came off him from every pore, from the way he stood, the way he looked, the way he breathed. "No," Grace said, her voice cutting cleanly through the suffocating silence of the room. Vincent tilted his head slightly, as if she had just spoken in a language he did not understand. "No, I don't want your money." One of the two bodyguards shifted, but Vincent lifted a hand, and the man froze at once. Vincent's black eyes studied Grace closely. Not angry, not surprised, only purely curious, as if she were a strange creature he had never encountered before. "You saved my life," he said slowly. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything, and now you're refusing my money. I saved you because you were dying. That's what any normal person would do." "No," Vincent shook his head. A thin smile, sharp as a blade, appeared on his mouth. "It isn't. Most people would step over my body and never look back. You're different." "I would so." Grace felt her heart beating harder, but she forced herself to stand straight, refusing to retreat from the weight of his gaze. "I'm not different. I'm just a baker. We have nothing to say to each other." "That's where you're wrong, Grace Sullivan." Vincent stepped closer, close enough that she caught the scent of expensive cologne and something darker underneath it. "The moment you dragged me through that door, you stepped into my world. Whether you wanted to or not. I don't belong to any world of yours." "You think so?" Vincent turned to glance through the front window, where the luxury cars still sat outside like a silent army. "This motorcade, you think no one sees it? You think no one wonders why Vincent Caruso is standing in a tiny bakery in the slums? News travels fast, Grace. By tonight, the whole city will know your name." Grace felt her blood run cold. She glanced at Mr. Harry, hoping for some kind of reassurance. But the old man only stood there trembling, his face drained white. "My dear," Mr. Harry whispered, sounding close to tears. "He doesn't just control the underworld. He is the underworld. The Caruso crew is everywhere, from the harbor to the casinos, from the skyscrapers to the darkest alleys. The people who stand against him, they disappear. No one ever finds the bodies." Grace looked back at Vincent, and this time she truly saw him. Not the dying man she had saved. Not the polished guest in an expensive suit, but a predator standing among sheep, calm and certain that no one could touch him. "I don't care who you are," she said, her voice shaking even as she tried to hold it steady. "I did what I had to do. We're even." Vincent watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes giving away nothing. Then he nodded once, slowly, as if he had just made a decision. "You think so?" he said. "I don't." 18. He turned and walked out, the two bodyguards following like shadows. The $5,000 still lay on the glass counter. "Keep it," Vincent said without looking back. "Consider it my thanks. And Grace, be careful. My world isn't kind to people who don't know how to protect themselves." The door shut. Engines roared in unison. And Grace stood there, surrounded by the warm smell of bread and the fear rising from the bottom of her chest, realizing her life had just turned toward a path she never could have imagined. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. Within 24 hours of Vincent Caruso's motorcade leaving Morrison's bakery, the whole neighborhood had heard. But they did not know the truth. They only knew what they wanted to believe. What made the story more irresistible as it traveled from one mouth to another. That Grace girl. Turns out she's the Mafia boss's mistress. Poor Mr. Harry. Hiring the wrong person. Who would have guessed? She looks so harmless, and she's running with criminals. Grace heard those whispers every time she stepped outside. Mrs. Wynne at the steamed bun shop stopped waving to her, replacing the familiar greeting with a measuring stare and a door slammed shut right in her face. Neighbors who used to smile now avoided her eyes, as if she carried some invisible disease that might spread. Even the children were yanked away by their parents whenever she walked past. Morrison's bakery went quiet and empty. The regulars, the old couples who bought bread every morning, the mothers who stopped in for sweets for their kids. All of them vanished as if the bakery had closed its doors for good. Mr. Harry did not say anything, but Grace saw the worry in his aging eyes each time he counted the cash in the register at the end of the day. Revenue dropped by nearly half in just 1 week. Grace wanted to explain. She wanted to shout that she was nobody's mistress, that she had only saved a man who was dying, that she had not known who he was, but who would believe her? And even if they did, would it change anything after Vincent Caruso had openly shown up at the shop with 50 luxury cars? Then Tommy showed up. Her brother came one evening, when Grace had just returned to her miserable apartment after a long day of enduring those contemptuous stares. He stood at her door, thinner than the last time she had seen him, eyes hollow, hands shaking like an addict. 22 years old, and he looked 40. "Grace," Tommy said, his voice rough. "I need your help." Grace stared at him, her heart tightening. She knew that look. She had seen it too many times. Every time Tommy lost at gambling and came back begging her to fix it. "How much this time?" she asked, exhausted. Tommy swallowed, unable to meet her eyes. 80,000, if we dough." Grace thought she had misheard. "What?" $80,000, Grace. Tears started sliding down his pale face. "I owe the Moretti crew. They gave me 2 weeks. If I don't pay, they'll kill me." The room seemed to tilt around Grace. $80,000. She worked 12 hours a day and made less than $2,000 a month. That amount was the sum of her whole life if she worked without eating or drinking. "Where did you even get $80,000 to gamble with?" she asked, her voice shaking. "They fronted it to me. I thought I could win it back, but..." Tommy collapsed, sobbing. I'm sorry, Grace." Grace wanted to slap him, wanted to scream that she had given up her youth for this family, dropped out of school, abandoned her dreams, worked herself to the bone, and he had wasted everything on stupid bets. But she could not. Tommy was her brother, the only blood she had left besides their mother. Thinking of her, Grace suddenly remembered the call from the hospital that morning, the one she had been trying not to think about all day. The doctor said her mother needed a new medication. Targeted therapy, more effective than chemotherapy, fewer side effects, but insurance would not cover it. $8,000 a month, and without it, her mother might not make it through the next 6 months. Grace stood in the cramped apartment, staring down at her brother crying at her feet, thinking of her mother lying alone in the hospital with tubes running everywhere, and she felt the world crushing her, piece by piece. $80,000 in gambling debt, $8,000 a month for medicine, rent, utilities, food, life, and she had only her calloused hands and a job she might lose at any moment now that no one wanted to buy bread from a bakery tied to the Mafia. Grace sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and for the first time in years, she cried. Not the silent crying she did on nights when she lay awake alone, worrying about the future. Real crying, ragged sobs breaking out from deep in her chest, tears pouring down a face hollowed out by sleeplessness. She had tried so hard. But maybe trying was not enough. In her pocket, the black card with the gold-stamped numbers lay perfectly still, heavy as an invitation from the dark. 3 days after the night Tommy showed up, Grace finished her shift later than usual. Mr. Harry told her to go home, but she insisted on staying to clean, not because she was diligent, but because she did not want to return to the empty apartment where the numbers of her debt spun through her mind every night. The clock read 10:45 when she locked the back door of the bakery and stepped into the dark alley that led out to the main road. She heard them before she saw them. Heavy footsteps, a wet, mean kind of chuckling drifting from the shadows. Grace stopped short, her survival instinct sharpening every sense. 4 figures peeled away from the corners, blocking the path ahead and the path behind. The faint streetlight fell across young faces that looked ruthless, eyes glittering with the hunger of predators. Well, look what we've got here. The one in front stepped closer, wearing a cheap leather jacket and a silver chain that caught the light. Vincent Caruso's little mistress. Grace took a step back until her spine hit cold brick. I don't know what you're talking about. You don't know? He sneered and glanced at his friends. This girl says she doesn't know. The whole city saw Caruso bring 50 cars to your bakery, and you're telling me you don't know? Another one moved in, a switchblade flashing in the dark. We want to send Caruso a message, and you're going to be the letter. Grace felt her blood turn to ice. She scanned for a way out, but there was none. 4 young men closed around her like wolves around prey. She could scream, but who would hear? Who would care? This was the kind of neighborhood where people learned to shut their eyes and cover their ears when someone begged for help. I have nothing to do with Vincent Caruso. Her voice shook even as she tried to keep it steady. I'm just a baker. A baker who knows how to save a man's life? The leader grabbed her hair and yanked hard enough to make her cry out. We heard you stitched him up. You're his people, and his people pay. Any say? He raised his hand, ready to bring it down on her face. When everything happened in a single blink, a black shadow slammed out of the far end of the alley. The man holding Grace by the hair was kicked off his feet, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. The one with the knife charged, but was stopped by a punch straight into the center of his face, blood exploding from his nose. The last 2 tried to run, but they did not make it. Both were sprawled on the ground within seconds. Grace braced herself against the wall, legs shaking so badly she could barely stand, and stared at the man who had saved her. He was built like a wall, shoulders wide, a neck so thick it seemed almost absent, his face cold and unreadable. She recognized him, one of the 2 bodyguards who had stood beside Vincent in the bakery that day. Miss Sullivan. His voice was low and even. Are you hurt? Grace shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. The man nodded, then turned to the 4 young men groaning on the pavement. Get out, he said, not loud but full of threat. Tell the Moretti crew she's protected. Next time I won't be gentle. The thugs scrambled up and fled into the shadows, not daring to look back. When they were gone, anger surged in Grace, fierce enough to drown out the fear. You've been watching me. It was not a question. The man did not deny it. Mr. Caruso ordered us to protect you from a distance. Anyone. I don't need anyone to protect me. I don't belong to him. With respect, Miss Sullivan, he said, still calm. What just happened shows you do need protection. And whether you belong to Mr. Caruso or not, that doesn't matter. His enemies think you belong to him. That alone is enough. Grace wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Those men had called her Caruso's mistress. They had wanted to use her to send a message. No matter what she said, no matter what the truth was, in the eyes of the underworld she had been marked. The man pulled a card from his pocket, but it was not the black one Grace had received. This one was white, plain, with only a phone number printed in black ink. Mr. Caruso's direct number, he said, placing it in her hand. I'm Marcus Webb. If anything happens, call this number, day or night. It's not a mint. Grace stared at the card in her hand, clean and white, like a promise or a curse. She could not tell which. I'm taking you home, Marcus said, not as an offer, but as a statement. And Grace, exhausted and trembling, no longer had the strength to refuse. The message came the next morning, from an unfamiliar number that Grace did not need to guess to know who it was. Riverside Park. 7 o'clock tonight. Alone. Short. No explanation. No request. As if the sender was completely certain she would come. And the most infuriating part was, he was right. Grace arrived at Riverside Park as the sun sank toward the horizon, staining the river a brilliant orange. This was the place she used to come with her father when she was a child, before life became too harsh to leave room for picnics. Now, standing on the stone path that led down to the water, she felt as if she were stepping onto someone else's territory. Vincent sat alone on a stone bench facing the river, his back to her. No bodyguards, no luxury cars, just a man in a simple black coat, watching the sunset as if searching for something he had lost a long time ago. When Grace drew closer, he did not turn his head, but she knew he had sensed her presence. You came, Vincent said, his voice low and calm. You didn't give me much of a choice. Grace sat at the far end of the bench, keeping distance, as if sitting too close might pull her into his gravity. Vincent turned to look at her, dark eyes catching the last light of day. Marcus said you were almost hurt last night, thanks to someone following me. You're angry. I don't like being watched like a criminal. You're not being watched like a criminal. Vincent looked back at the river, his tone distant. You're being protected like someone important. Just wait. Grace wanted to argue, but she knew arguing with this man would lead nowhere. Instead, she asked what had been burning in her mind for days. That night, what happened? Why were you shot? Vincent was silent for a long moment, long enough that Grace thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice even, as if telling someone else's story. I have a council. 7 men helped me run everything. 3 weeks ago, I discovered 4 of them were planning to overthrow me. They made a deal with rival families, promised to divide territory after I was dead. He paused, his breathing heavy. That meeting in the alley was supposed to be a negotiation. It turned out to be an execution. A chill crawled up Grace's spine. She had known Vincent was dangerous, but hearing him speak about betrayal and murder with that calm, measured voice made her realize who she was sitting beside. I killed 2 of them before I was hit, Vincent went on. Lost my entire security team in the fight. Made it 3 blocks before I collapsed in the alley behind your bakery. He turned to her, and for the first time Grace saw something close to gratitude in those cold eyes. 30 seconds. If you'd waited 30 more seconds, they would have come back and found both of us. Grace swallowed, not knowing what to say. 6 months ago. Vincent changed the subject abruptly, his voice dropping. My wife died. Cancer. Her name was Maria. He looked down at his hands, and Grace realized they were the hands of a man holding something very deep inside. I had all the money in the world, the best doctors, the most expensive drugs, but I couldn't save her. The air between them shifted. Grace looked at the man beside her, the most powerful Mafia boss in the city, and for the first time, she saw the grief of a husband who had lost his wife. You stitched me up with a cheap first aid kit and a bottle of vodka, Vincent said, his voice light as a breath. No modern equipment. No doctors. Just flour dust on your hands and courage. He looked at her. Do you know what surprised me most? You saved me. Grace did not know how to respond to that sudden sincerity. She only sat there, waiting. Vincent reached into his coat and pulled out a thin file folder, placing it on the bench between them. I know about your brother. $80,000 owed to the Moretti crew. I know about your mother. Stage 3, lung cancer. Needing an $8,000 medication each month that insurance won't cover. He spoke without emotion, as if reading a financial report. I can fix all of it. Grace felt her heart miss a beat. And what do you want in return? You work for me. Vincent met her eyes. Not illegal work. I'm building community projects. I need someone who can connect with ordinary people. You're the perfect bridge. You want me to be a front. I want you to do what you're already good at. Helping people. Vincent stood, looking down at her. Think carefully, Grace. Tommy's debt will disappear. Your mother will get the best treatment. You won't have to worry about money anymore. And I'll belong to you. Vincent smiled. The first smile she had seen on his face. Cold, but not entirely without feeling. You've belonged to my world since the night you opened that door, Grace. The only question is where you'll stand in that world. Then he walked away, leaving Grace alone with the file folder and a choice that could never be easy. Grace called Vincent the next morning, the moment she woke after a night of sleepless tossing and turning. She had thought through every angle of his offer, turning it over and over in her mind. But in the end, the answer remained the same. No, she said when he picked up, her voice firmer than she felt inside. I can't work for you. I'll handle it myself. Silence stretched on the other end of the line, long enough that Grace thought Vincent had hung up. Then his voice came, low and distant. Are you sure? I'm sure. All right. But Grace, if you change your mind, you know how to reach me. Then he ended the call. No argument. No further persuasion. It should have made her feel relieved, but instead it only made her more uneasy. Vincent Caruso was not the kind of man who accepted rejection easily. So why did he let go so quickly? The next 3 days passed under a low, constant tension. Grace worked at the bakery, trying to ignore the probing stares and whispered talk of the neighbors. She visited her mother at the hospital, listened as the doctor brought up the new medication again. Worry etched across his face when Grace said she needed more time. She avoided Tommy, not because she was angry with him, but because she did not know how to look him in the eye when she had no way to save him. She told herself she would find a way. She had survived so much in her life. She would survive this too. She did not need Vincent Caruso. She did not need anyone. Then the third night came. The wail of fire sirens tore Grace out of sleep at 3 a.m. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and looked out the window. The distant night sky burned a harsh orange, thick black smoke rolling upward, as if someone had opened the gates of hell in the middle of this poor neighborhood. Grace threw on clothes and ran outside, pulled along with the stream of people rushing toward the blaze. The Patterson grocery. The flames had swallowed the entire 2-story building, licking at the night sky with brutal force. Fire trucks packed the street. Hoses blasted water in heavy streams, but nothing seemed to slow the fury of the fire. Neighbors stood all around, faces lit bright by flame, terrified and unable to look away. And in the middle of the crowd, Margaret Patterson collapsed to her knees on the sidewalk, screaming as if her soul were being torn in half. Walter's still in there. Someone save my husband. Grace stood frozen, her feet nailed to the pavement. Walter, the gentle 64-year-old man who always slipped her an extra apple whenever she bought fruit. The man who always smiled and asked after her mother's health whenever he saw her. He was still inside that wall of fire. A firefighter ran out of the wreckage and shook his head at his crew. That single shake was a death sentence. Margaret let out a howl that ripped through the night, then collapsed unconscious into the arms of the neighbors. Grace wanted to run forward, to help, but her legs would not move. She stood there amid the chaos and watched the fire devour everything. Someone beside her whispered, voice thick with fear, "The Morettis. They're sending a message to Vincent Caruso." Moretti. The name drove into Grace's chest like a knife. The Moretti crew, the men Tommy owed, the ones who had sent thugs to attack her in the alley. They burned the Patterson store not because the couple had done anything wrong. They burned it to prove Vincent Caruso could not protect anyone. They burned it because this neighborhood had been marked as Vincent's territory the moment he brought 50 luxury cars to the bakery. They burned it because of her. Because she had saved Vincent Caruso. Tears ran down Grace's cheeks without her noticing. Walter was dead. An innocent man dead because criminals wanted to send a message to a mafia boss. Dead because of a power game between men he had never even known. Dead because he lived in a neighborhood where a baker had accidentally dragged darkness home. Grace looked around and saw the neighbor's eyes beginning to turn toward her. Not curiosity now, not contempt. Now it was hatred. The hatred of people who had just lost one of their own and needed someone to blame. "It's because of that girl," someone said loudly, and Grace felt as if she had been slapped. "She brought the mafia here." She wanted to explain. She wanted to scream that she had only saved a dying man, that she never wanted any of this. But her throat locked, and the words died before they could form. Margaret came to, eyes swollen and red as she searched the crowd, and then stopped on Grace. That look, full of grief and fury, burned Grace worse than the fire roaring in front of them. Grace turned and ran. Ran from the flames, from the stairs, from Margaret's sobs chasing after her. She ran until her lungs were on fire and her legs could not take another step, then collapsed in a dark corner, crying as if she had never cried before. Walter was dead. And no matter what she said, no matter how she explained, she knew part of it was her fault. Her kindness had killed an innocent man. The days after the fire were a living hell for Grace. She did not dare leave her apartment for the first 2 days. Curled up on her bed and staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about Margaret's eyes, about that heart-splitting scream, about Walter's gentle face she would never see again. But life did not allow her to hide forever. Rent was coming due. Her mother's hospital bills were still piling up, and she still had to eat to stay alive. On the 3rd day, Grace stepped outside, and she understood what it meant for the whole world to turn its back on you. Mrs. Nguyen slammed the steamed bun shop door shut right in her face. The young men who usually loitered on the corner spat toward her as she passed. Mothers pulled their children to the other side of the street, as if Grace carried some contagious disease. No one looked her in the eye, but she heard the whispers trailing behind every step. That girl who kills people. Ever. Because of her, Walter died. Mafia. She's Mafia. Grace kept her head down and walked faster, fighting to swallow the tears rising in her throat. She had lived in this neighborhood for 6 years. She knew every neighbor's name, knew who liked what kind of bread, knew which child was in which grade. She had thought this was home, but now she was nothing but a hated stranger. Morrison's bakery was open when she arrived. Grace went in through the back door as she always did, tied on her apron, and got ready to start working. But Mr. Harry was waiting for her in the kitchen, his old face carved with worry and pain. "Sit down, Grace," he said, his voice tired. She knew what was coming. She knew from the moment she saw his eyes, but she sat anyway, still hoping she was wrong. "I've thought of you like a daughter for 6 years," Mr. Harry began, his voice catching. You've been the hardest working employee I've ever had. I know you're a good person, Grace. I know none of this is your fault. But, Grace said, her voice dry. Mr. Harry closed his eyes, as if saying it aloud would tear him apart from the inside. But I can't keep you on. No one's coming in to buy bread anymore. They're scared. They think if they come here, they'll be the next target. He opened his eyes, and Grace saw tears shining there. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I truly am. 18. Grace did not cry. She had cried too much these past days. Maybe she had run out of tears. She only nodded, untied her apron and set it on the table, then stood. I understand, she said, her voice so calm it surprised even her. Thank you for everything, Mr. Harry. Thank you for giving me a chance. She walked out without looking back. If she looked back, she would fall apart, and she could not fall apart. Not yet. On her way home, she passed the wreckage of the Patterson grocery. Margaret stood there, staring at what was left of her life. And when she turned and saw Grace, that look cut through Grace like a knife. You, Margaret said. A single word, but it held all the hatred of a woman who had just lost the love of her life. Grace wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but she knew there were no words that could soften Margaret's pain. She lowered her head and kept walking, feeling that hateful stare burning into her back the entire way home. That night, Grace sat alone in her apartment, swallowed by darkness. She did not turn on the lights. She did not eat. She did nothing at all. She simply sat there, her back against the wall, staring into empty space. Her mother was dying in the hospital. Her brother was being hunted over a massive debt. She had just lost her job. Her neighbors hated her. An innocent man had died because of her, and she had nothing left. Nothing at all. The white card lay on her bedside table, where she had placed it the night Marcus gave it to her. Grace stared at it for a long time in the dark, as if she were staring at her own future. She thought of how she had refused Vincent. She thought of the foolish pride that made her believe she could handle everything on her own. She thought of Walter, of the flames, of Margaret's eyes. Then she reached for the card, dialed the number, and waited. Vincent answered on the second ring. I accept, Grace said, her voice trembling but no longer uncertain. But I have a condition. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Vincent's voice came, low and calm as ever. I'm listening. The glossy black car picked Grace up in front of her apartment at 9 that night, just 1 hour after the phone call. Marcus was in the driver's seat. He gave her a brief nod without speaking, and Grace slid into the back seat in silence. She did not ask where they were going. She did not need to. She knew Vincent Caruso would not meet her anywhere ordinary. The ride lasted nearly 45 minutes, cutting through the city's crowded streets, through neighborhoods that grew more and more affluent, until they stopped in front of a towering iron gate decorated with intricate patterns. The gate opened, and the car glided along a winding stone drive lined with perfectly trimmed trees, leading to a white mansion that looked as if it had stepped out of a film about Europe's upper class. Grace stepped out, suddenly small and out of place in the suffocating luxury. Warm, golden light washed over the front of the mansion. Tall windows mirrored the night sky, and by the main entrance, Vincent was waiting. He wore a black shirt, no suit jacket, no bodyguards at his back, so ordinary-looking that Grace almost did not recognize him. But those eyes were the same, dark and piercing, watching her as if reading every thought in her mind. You're here, Vincent said, not sounding surprised. You told me to come. I tell a lot of people to come. Not everyone comes. He turned and gestured for her to follow. Come inside. We have a lot to talk about. Inside, the mansion was even more impressive than the outside. Polished marble floors, oil paintings on the walls that Grace suspected each cost as much as her entire apartment, crystal chandeliers glittering like captured stars. But what struck her most was the silence. The mansion was vast and luxurious, but empty and cold, like a museum with no visitors. Vincent led her into an office with a large oak desk, a fireplace snapping softly, and 2 leather chairs facing each other. He sat in one and indicated the other. You said you have conditions, he began, going straight to the point. I'm listening. Grace drew a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes. She had thought about this all night, weighing each condition carefully. First, you protect the whole neighborhood, not just me. Everyone living there, from Mr. Harry to Mrs. Nguyen, to anyone who steps onto that street, is protected. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Walter died because the Morettis wanted to send you a message. I don't want anyone else paying for wars they have nothing to do with. Vincent nodded slowly, not interrupting. Second, No violence unless it's necessary. I know who you are. I know how your world works. But if I'm going to work with you, I need to know blood won't be spilled for reasons that could have been avoided. And third, I get to know every decision that affects the neighborhood. No secrets. No doing things behind my back and leaving me to face the consequences. Silence stretched out. The fire crackled. Grace felt her heart pound wildly in her chest. She had just laid down terms to the most powerful mafia boss in the city, as if she had the right to negotiate. Maybe he would laugh in her face. Maybe he would throw her out. But Vincent did not laugh. He studied her with an unreadable look, then nodded. Agreed. Grace blinked, not believing what she had heard. Agreed? All three? All three. Vincent rose and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. Do you think I want a war with the Morettis? War costs money, costs men, and most of all, it's bad for business. He turned back to her. I'm not planning to hit the Morettis with guns. I'm planning to hit them with money. Economic alliances. I'll buy up debts, invest in shops, create a buffer zone the Morettis can't touch without destroying themselves. He returned to sit across from her. You're the perfect bridge. You're one of them. You understand them. You can talk to them. I need you to make this plan real. Grace listened, trying to process it all. It was not what she expected. She had thought Vincent would want her as a cover for illegal operations, but what he described sounded like an actual business strategy, not a criminal scheme. As for Tommy's debt, Vincent continued, as if reading her mind, it will be erased before midnight. Your mother will be transferred to St. Mary's Hospital tomorrow morning, with the best doctors and every cost covered indefinitely. Tears rose before Grace could stop them. She had fought alone for so long, carried too much by herself. And now, with a single conversation, the burdens crushing her shoulders were suddenly lifted. Why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why are you doing all of this? Vincent looked at her, and for the first time Grace saw something different in those deep black eyes. Not coldness, not power, loneliness. The loneliness of a man who had lost everything and did not know how to find his way back. Because you gave me a chance to do the right thing, he said, his voice lower than usual. And that's something I don't get very often. I was braided. The old community hall sat at the end of the street, a red brick building from the 1950s, with tall windows and wooden floors that creaked under every step. This was where the neighborhood used to hold gatherings, simple weddings, small celebrations. But tonight, it became a battlefield. 60 people sat on rows of wooden chairs pressed close together, faces tight with tension and hostility. The steamed bun shop owner, the mechanic who ran the garage, the laundromat owner, the corner storekeepers, street vendors, freelancers. All of them came, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice once Vincent Caruso sent an invitation. No one dared refuse a mafia boss, but that did not mean they had to like it. Grace stood in the corner of the hall, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes landing on her whenever someone glanced her way. In their eyes, she was a traitor. The girl who had dragged darkness into their neighborhood and now stood beside the very source of it. Mister, Harry sat in the back row, not looking at her, his old eyes tired and worried. Margaret sat in the front, her back straight as a board, her face cold as stone. Vincent stepped forward, and the hall fell silent. No whispers, no coughs, only the heavy quiet of people facing something far larger than themselves. I know what you think of me, Vincent began, his deep voice carrying through the stillness. You think I'm a criminal. You're right. He paused, letting the words sink in. I spent 15 years building an empire with violence and threats. I've done things you don't want to know. I'm not standing here to ask forgiveness, because I don't deserve it. A low murmur started, but Vincent lifted his hand, and it died at once. But I am standing here to offer a choice. This neighborhood is trapped in a war that isn't yours. The Morettis want to hit me, and you are the ones paying the price. His gaze moved to Margaret. Walter Patterson paid the price. With his life. Margaret did not move, but Grace saw her shoulders tremble. I can't bring him back, Vincent continued, but I can make sure no one else has to die. Not through war, through alliance. He laid out the plan. Economic investment, community protection. How to turn the neighborhood into a buffer zone no gang would dare touch. But Grace could see the doubt on the faces around her. They did not believe him. They could not. Then Vincent turned to her and gave a small nod. This was her moment. Grace stepped forward, her legs shaking as if they might give out. 60 pairs of eyes fixed on her. 60 faces full of judgment and hostility. She wanted to run, to turn her back and disappear. But she thought of her mother in the hospital, of Tommy freed from a deadly debt, of the promise she had made to herself. "I know you hate me," she began, her voice trembling but clear. "I don't blame you. 3 months ago, I saved someone who was dying in the alley behind the bakery. I didn't know who he was. I only thought it was the right thing to do." She swallowed, fighting the tears threatening to rise. "Walter died because of my choice. I have to live with that every day, every night. Every time I close my eyes, I see that fire. Every time I open them, I see Margaret's eyes." Margaret still stared straight ahead, expressionless. "I'm not standing here to ask forgiveness," Grace said, repeating Vincent's words, but with an entirely different meaning. "I'm standing here because I owe you. I owe Walter. I owe Margaret. I owe every person who is dragged into this war because of me." She drew a deep breath. "This isn't a choice between good and evil. There are no saints here. This is a choice between living and dying, between letting this neighborhood be crushed in a war between gangs, or standing up and protecting ourselves." She looked around the hall, taking in every familiar face that now felt like a stranger's. "I don't deserve your trust, but I'm asking for one chance. One chance to prove that my kindness that night, even after all the suffering it caused, can still lead to something good. I want of they." Silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Then Margaret stood. The entire hall held its breath. The widow of the man who had died in the flames stepped forward, each step slow and heavy. Grace felt her heart stop when Margaret came to a halt in front of her, old eyes locking onto hers. "My husband," Margaret said, her voice rough from too much crying, "believed in human kindness. He used to say that good people should do good things, no matter how hard it is." She paused, and Grace saw tears shining in her eyes. This girl saved a dying man without asking questions. That was good. What happened afterward isn't her fault. It's the fault of this cruel world. Margaret turned to Vincent, then back to Grace. "My husband is gone. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure he didn't die for nothing." Margaret walked to the table where the alliance contracts lay waiting, picked up the pen, and signed her name. A wave of murmurs broke out across the hall. Then Mr. Harry stood, walked forward, and signed after her. Then Mrs. Nguyen, then one person after another, until nearly the entire hall had put pen to paper. Grace stood there, tears streaming down her cheeks, and for the first time in months, she felt something close to hope. That night, when the last person left the hall, 53 signatures lay across the alliance contracts. Not all 60 people, but enough to create change. Grace stood there, looking at the papers spread across the table, each familiar name written in strokes that were shaky or firm, and she felt as if she were watching history being written right in front of her. Vincent stood beside her, silent, observing. When she turned to look at him, she caught an expression she could not read. Not the usual coldness, not the calculation of a Mafia boss. There was something deeper in those dark eyes, something close to surprise, as if he were seeing something even he had not expected. "You did it," he said, his voice low, unusually gentle. Grace did not know what to say. She only nodded, too exhausted to find words. Over the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood began to change. The changes came slowly, like water dripping onto stone, patient and relentless. First came the security team, men in ordinary guard uniforms instead of threatening black suits, patrolling the streets quietly but effectively. No one dared cause trouble. No more strangers lurking at night. For the first time in years, the neighborhood grew peaceful. Then came the investment. Mrs. Nguyen's steamed bun shop was renovated with a new kitchen and a bright, polished sign. Tony's garage gained modern equipment and 2 new employees. Small businesses were offered access to funding at interest rates so low they were almost nothing. And most importantly, the Patterson grocery, or rather Margaret's grocery now, was rebuilt from the ashes, bigger and better than before. Grace stood watching the construction one afternoon, observing the workers moving with quick, professional efficiency. Margaret stood beside her, her face still marked by a grief that would not leave, but the fury in her eyes had softened. "It won't bring Walter back," Margaret said, her voice light as wind. "I know," Grace replied. "Nothing can bring him back." Margaret turned to look at her, and for the first time since the night of the fire, that gaze was not filled with hatred. "But Walter would want me to keep living. He would want me to rebuild." She paused. "Maybe he would want me to forgive, too." Grace did not dare ask whether Margaret had forgiven her yet. She knew some wounds needed time to heal, and some wounds would never fully heal. She only nodded and kept standing there, beside the woman she had unintentionally made lose everything. In those same 2 weeks, Grace's life changed in ways she had never dared dream of. She moved into a new apartment in a secure building where the elevator worked, Hot water ran steadily, and the windows looked out over a park instead of soot-gray brick walls. It was not luxurious like Vincent's mansion, but it was clean, safe, and entirely hers. Her mother was transferred to St. Mary's Hospital, just as Vincent promised. The doctors there were not only skilled, but deeply attentive, and the new medication began to work. Eleanor Sullivan, a woman so thin Grace feared each visit might be the last, began to regain color in her face. She could sit up, talk, even take a few steps around the room. The doctor said her condition was improving significantly, and for the first time, they used the word hope. Tommy changed too. The $80,000 debt vanished as if it had never existed, and her 22-year-old brother was given a job managing inventory for one of Vincent's legitimate businesses. The work was not glamorous, but the pay was enough, and more importantly, it kept Tommy away from the casinos and temptations that had nearly killed him. Grace watched her brother leave for work each morning, return each night with a tired face that was no longer desperate, and she knew it was what she had prayed for years. One evening, Grace stood on the balcony of her new apartment, looking down at the street as it slowly came back to life. The lights from newly renovated shops shimmered in the dark. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere. Soft music floated out from the corner cafe. The neighborhood was still poor, still full of problems, but it was no longer drowning in the darkness of fear. Hope. The thing Grace thought she had lost long ago was flickering back. Small and fragile, but real. She just did not know the darkness had never truly left. It was only waiting. The phone rang at 2 a.m, and Grace knew instantly something was wrong. No one called at that hour unless the world was falling apart. Marcus's voice came through the line, cold and clipped as always, but something in it was different. An urgency she had never heard from him before. "You need to come now. Warehouse number 7, the East Industrial District. Don't ask, just come." Then he hung up. Grace got dressed in 3 minutes and ran into the street. The only taxi still operating at this hour carried her through empty streets, and the entire ride she tried not to imagine the worst. But her instincts knew. Her instincts always knew. The warehouse was a soot-gray building in the middle of an abandoned industrial zone, with a rusted metal door and brick walls stained with mold. Marcus waited outside, his face as expressionless as stone. He said nothing, only opened the door and stepped aside. Grace went in, and her heart stopped. Tommy lay on the cold concrete floor, hands tied behind his back, his face covered in blood. His left eye was swollen shut. His lip was split. Dried blood had crusted across his forehead. Her 22-year-old brother, the boy she had protected her whole life, was lying there like an animal that had been beaten senseless. Grace rushed to him and dropped to her knees, trembling fingers wiping blood from his face. Tommy, can you hear me?" Tommy groaned, his right eye cracking open, looking at her with the dull, faraway stare of someone who had been through hell. "Sis, Grace." His voice was shredded, as if his throat had been squeezed raw. I'm sorry. Then Grace saw it. On the wall behind him, red paint like blood, scrawled into crooked, malicious letters. "Caruso can't protect anyone." Rage ignited inside her like gasoline meeting flame. She sprang to her feet and turned on Marcus, her eyes burning. "Where is he?" she snarled. "Where's Vincent?" Marcus did not answer, but footsteps sounded at the doorway. Vincent walked in, his face cold as ever, but Grace saw his jaw clenched tight, as if he were holding something back deep inside. "Grace, you promised." She stalked toward him, no fear left, no hesitation, only the pure fury of a sister who had just seen her brother brutalized. "You promised you would protect us. You said no one could touch your people. So what is this?" She pointed at Tommy, at the words on the wall, and her voice broke. "My brother was kidnapped under your people's eyes. They beat him and dumped him here like trash. Is this your protection?" Vincent stood still, taking her anger without flinching. When Grace paused to breathe, he spoke, his voice low and heavy. "I failed. I'm sorry." Grace froze. She had not expected an apology. She had braced herself for excuses, for reasons, for empty promises. Not for something that direct. The Morettis did this. Vincent went on, his tone ice cold, but his eyes burning. "They grabbed him when he left the warehouse last night. Even though the debt was cleared, they chose to ignore it to send a message. Proving my alliance means nothing. So what are you going to do?" Grace asked, her voice shaking as she fought the sob rising in her throat. "Hit back? Kill them? That's what they want." Vincent stepped closer, stopping directly in front of her. "If I respond with violence, it becomes all-out war, dozens dead. Your neighborhood turned into a battlefield. So you want me to sit still and watch my brother get beaten and do nothing? No, Vincent held her gaze. I want you to meet Anthony Moretti, face to face. Grace thought she had misheard. What? Negotiate. Moretti is a businessman, before he's a criminal. He doesn't want war any more than I do, because war costs money and draws police attention. He's testing my limits, watching how I react. Vincent paused. But he didn't expect you. Me? Grace let out a bitter laugh. A baker negotiating with a mafia boss? A baker who convinced 53 people to sign an alliance with the man they hate most. Vincent did not smile. You're not afraid of me, Grace. You won't be afraid of him. And that's something Moretti doesn't know how to deal with. If you won. Grace looked back at Tommy, at the blood on his face, at the wounds that would leave scars in flesh and in mind. Then she looked at the words on the wall. Caruso can't protect anyone. Her teeth clenched. All right, she said, her voice hard as steel. Set up the meeting. I'll talk to Moretti. Vincent nodded. And in those deep black eyes, Grace caught a flicker of something close to respect. The Italian restaurant sat in a middle-class neighborhood, far from both Vincent's territory and Moretti's, a neutral place both sides had agreed to. From the outside, it looked like any family restaurant, with an old wooden sign and flower pots lined along the windows. But Grace knew there was nothing normal inside. Vincent had spent the entire previous day preparing her. He talked about Anthony Moretti, about how the man thought, his weaknesses, and his strengths. He's a businessman before he's a criminal, Vincent said. He likes money more than blood, but he'll spill blood if he thinks it profits him. Don't let him see you're afraid. Don't take the bait when he provokes you. And most of all, never let him think you have nothing to lose. Now, standing in front of the restaurant door, Grace felt all that advice dissolve like mist. All that remained was a 27-year-old woman about to step into the devil's den. Vincent walked beside her, steady and confident. 2 bodyguards followed, but they would stop at the door. Inside, it would be only Grace, Vincent, and whoever Moretti brought with him. The moment they entered, Grace saw him. Anthony Moretti sat at a table in the center of the restaurant. An obese man with salt and pepper hair slicked neatly back, and a dark blue suit stretched tight around his thick belly. He was smiling, a grin wide enough to show gleaming white teeth, but it never reached his eyes. Pig eyes, small and sharp, measuring them as if pricing every step. Well, look who's here. Moretti clapped his hands, his voice shrill in the nearly empty restaurant. Vincent Caruso and the famous little baker. I hear you're good with a needle, sweetheart. Grace did not answer. She walked to the table and sat across from him, keeping her face calm even as her heart thundered in her chest. Vincent took the seat beside her, silent as shadow. Moretti leaned forward, elbows on the table, the fake smile still pasted on his mouth. So, little girl, I hear you want to talk. Talk. I'm listening. Grace drew a deep breath. You burned the Patterson's store. You had my brother beaten. You wanted to send Mr. Caruso a message. That's right. Moretti nodded without denying it. And the message got delivered, didn't it? What's your message? Grace asked, her voice steadier than she felt. That you can burn buildings and hurt people? Everyone already knows that. Moretti's smile tightened. You've got nerve, girl. I don't have nerve. I'm just tired. Grace held his gaze. What do you want, Mr. Moretti? Say it. A war with Mr. Caruso? You might win, maybe. But what will you lose? Money, men, attention from the police and the FBI. Are you sure it's worth it? Moretti watched her for a long moment. The smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. 30%, he said at last. 30% of the profit from every business operation in your neighborhood. In return, I back off completely. Vincent beside Grace shifted slightly, but he did not speak. This was her negotiation. 30%? Grace repeated, her voice not trembling at all. You're joking. That neighborhood is dirt poor. 30% of nothing is still nothing, but it'll grow. Moretti gave a small laugh. With Caruso's investment, in 5 years it'll be different. I'm investing long-term, you understand? 12%? Moretti blinked, as if he had misheard. What did you say? 12% of the profit. In return, you never touch the neighborhood. Not ever. No arson. No kidnappings. No sending thugs to stir trouble. That street becomes neutral ground. Grace leaned in. And we meet by video call once a month for reporting, not in person. I don't want to look at you more than I have to. Silence stretched across the restaurant. Moretti stared at her, as if she were something from another planet, those tiny pig eyes flickering with something between anger and amusement. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he asked, his voice dropping into something dangerous. "I do." Grace did not back down. "I'm talking to the man who burned down a 64-year-old store and had my brother beaten. You could kill me right now, but you won't, because killing me means war with Caruso, and war is expensive." She paused. 12%. Take it or leave it. Moretti burst into laughter, a thick, booming sound filling the empty restaurant. He slapped the table hard enough to make the water glasses tremble. "You really do have nerve, girl. More nerve than most men I've met in 30 years. He shook his head, still laughing. "All right, 12%. But if Caruso breaks his word, if that neighborhood doesn't grow like he promises, I'm coming back. And next time, there won't be any negotiating." "Deal." Grace stood, unwilling to spend one more second there. "Pleasure doing business with you." Moretti nodded, the smile still on his mouth, but his eyes now completely cold. "You're interesting, Grace Sullivan. I'll remember your face." Grace did not answer. She turned and walked out of the restaurant, Vincent behind her. She passed through the door, crossed the parking lot, reached the black car waiting, and slid into the back seat. The door shut, and Grace began to shake. She shook so hard her whole body felt like it might break apart. Her teeth chattered. Her hands clenched the hem of her shirt until her knuckles went white. She had forced herself to hold it together through the entire meeting, kept her face calm, kept her voice steady. But now that it was over, her body betrayed her. Vincent sat beside her in silence. Then he did something that startled Grace. He removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders, gentle, without a word. "You did very well," he said at last, his voice low, unusually soft. Grace did not answer. She only sat there, trembling beneath the warm coat of a Mafia boss, and wondered what kind of person she had become. 2 months had passed since the meeting with Anthony Moretti, and life had slowly returned to a rhythm Grace had almost forgotten was possible. The agreement held, the Moretti crew backed away from the neighborhood, and the economic alliance kept growing. Grace stayed busy with coordination work, meeting shop owners, solving the small problems that rose up every day. She began to grow used to this new life, used to seeing the street come back to life one day at a time, used to the feeling that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. Then 2 detectives showed up. They came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, while Grace was drinking coffee in her new apartment. The doorbell rang, and when she opened the door, 2 people in suits stood there with the grave, trouble-carrying look of professionals. "Grace Sullivan?" The woman spoke first, tall and thin, with graying hair pulled into a neat bun at the back of her head. "I'm Detective Karen Shaw. This is my partner, Detective Paul Reeves. We'd like you to come to the station to answer a few questions." It was not a request, not an invitation. It was an order dressed up in a polite tone. Grace knew she had no choice. The police station sat in the heart of downtown, a soot-gray building with long, hollow corridors and cold fluorescent lights. They led her into a small interrogation room, 4 bare walls, a metal table, 3 chairs, and a pane of glass she knew was a one-way mirror. Shaw sat across from her. Reeves leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching. "You know why you're here, don't you?" Shaw began, her voice cold as ice. "I'm guessing it's about Vincent Caruso." "That's right." Shaw opened a file folder, pulled out a stack of photographs, and laid them on the table. Grace saw herself in those pictures, dragging a man through the back door of the bakery, the faint light from a street lamp catching her face, wide-eyed and terrified. "This is security footage from the building across the street. The night of April 13th, 12:52 in the morning. You pulled Vincent Caruso into Morrison's bakery and hid him from the people chasing him. I was not forrated." Grace looked at the photographs, her heart hammering, but her face stayed still. "You sheltered a wanted criminal," Shaw continued, her tone sharp. "You could be facing charges of aiding and abetting, obstruction of justice, and possibly conspiracy. Charges like these can put you in prison for years." Reeves spoke for the first time, his voice gentler than his partner's. "But we don't want to arrest you, Grace. We want to help you." "Help me?" Grace asked, her voice dry. "Testify against Caruso." Shaw leaned forward. "Tell us everything you know about him, about his organization, about what's happening in that neighborhood. In return, we place you in witness protection, a new identity, a new life. In another city, you'll be safe." Grace looked from Shaw to Reeves, then down at the photographs on the table. In the images, she looked younger, more innocent. She had not yet known that the door she opened that night would change everything. "And my mother?" she asked, My brother? The neighborhood I'm trying to protect? Shaw frowned. We can arrange. You can't arrange anything. Grace cut her off, her voice suddenly hard. Do you know the Moretti crew burned the Pattersons' grocery? Walter died in that fire. Where were you? Did you stop it? She pushed back her chair and stood, the legs scraping the floor. My brother was kidnapped and beaten. Where were you? I was cornered by thugs in a dark alley. Where were you? Shaw opened her mouth to respond, but Grace did not give her the chance. You're here now, after everything has already happened, with photographs and promises about witness protection. But you can't protect anyone. You didn't stop the fire. You didn't save Walter. You didn't find the people who kidnapped my brother. Grace held Shaw's eyes. Vincent Caruso did what you didn't do. He protected that neighborhood. He rebuilt Margaret's store. He created jobs for people who had nothing. He's a criminal, Shaw snapped. And you're the police, Grace said calmly. But when the people in my neighborhood needed protection, the only one who stepped forward was a criminal. What does that say about your system? A heavy silence settled over the interrogation room. You're destroying your life, Reeves said, disappointment in his voice. If you don't cooperate, then you'll arrest me? Grace asked. Go ahead, but you won't have a witness. You won't have any evidence beyond photographs showing me helping an injured man. And Mr. Caruso's lawyers will tear your case apart before it ever reaches a courtroom. She walked to the door, stopped, and turned back to look at the two detectives one last time. I'm not a good person. I've made choices a good person would never make. But at least my choices keep the people I love alive. She opened the door. Can you say the same? Grace stepped out of the police station, sunlight stinging her eyes after the darkness of the interrogation room. She went down the steps, past rows of parked patrol cars, and out onto the busy sidewalk. And she knew. In that moment, she had crossed a line she could not uncross. She had refused the police. She had chosen Vincent Caruso's side. In the eyes of the law, she was no longer a victim or a witness. She was an accomplice. But strangely, Grace did not feel afraid. She felt an odd kind of peace. The peace of someone who has accepted the road she chose, no matter where it leads. That night, Grace stood on the balcony of her new apartment, looking down at a city slowly sinking into darkness. Lights from the high-rises blinked like fallen stars scattered across the earth. And far off she could see her neighborhood, where newly renovated shops were still lit, where life was slowly returning from ash. She thought about what had happened over the last few hours. She had looked two detectives in the eye and refused their offer. She had defended Vincent Caruso, a Mafia boss, right in front of the police. With only a few sentences, she had turned herself from a witness into an accomplice. 6 months ago, who was she? An ordinary bakery worker, working 12 hours a day, worrying about rent and hospital bills, dreaming of a better life she never truly believed would arrive. She was a good person, or at least she thought she was. She helped her neighbors, cared for her mother, looked after her brother. She believed in justice. She believed in the law. She believed that doing the right thing led to good outcomes. Now, looking back, she no longer knew what she believed in. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Grace glanced at the screen, not surprised to see Vincent's number. I heard about what happened at the station, his voice said the moment she answered, low and calm as always. Marcus reported that you refused to cooperate with them. You're watching the police too. I watch anything that could affect you. Vincent paused. Thank you, Grace. You didn't have to do that. I didn't do it for you. Grace's voice was tired. I did it for the neighborhood. For my mother. For Tommy. For everyone who would be affected if you were arrested and everything fell apart. I know. Vincent's voice softened. But whatever the reason, you still stood with me when you could have chosen something else. That matters. Grace did not answer. She stared out into the distance, where streetlights flickered like small flames in the night. Do you regret it? Vincent asked after a long silence. The question forced Grace to stop and think. Regret. She had turned down a way out of all of it, turned down a new life, a new name, the safety witness protection might have offered. She had chosen to stay in the dark instead of stepping into the light. I don't know, she said honestly. I think I should regret it. I think I should hate everything that's happening. I negotiated with a Mafia boss, refused the police, made myself a target. She drew a slow breath. But the scariest part is that I don't hate it. Not as much as I should. Dense silence on the line. When I look at the neighborhood now, Grace continued, sounding as if she were speaking to herself, I see shops open for business. I see children playing in the street without fear. I see Margaret rebuilding her life. My mother is getting stronger. Tommy has steady work. She paused. All of that happened because of you, Vincent. Because of your money. Because of your power. Because of the things I'm supposed to hate. But you don't hate them. No. And that scares me. Grace let out a small laugh that held no joy. What am I becoming, Vincent? The line between right and wrong, between good and evil, it's blurring in my head. I don't even know where I stand anymore. Vincent was quiet for so long, Grace thought he had ended the call. Then his voice came again, low and distant. You're standing where most people are too afraid to stand. Between two worlds, not fully belonging to either one. He paused. That isn't a bad thing, Grace. It's necessary. Necessary for who? For the people who need someone to speak for them. For the people who don't have a voice in either world. Vincent's tone turned unexpectedly serious. You're not bad because you don't hate what's happening. You're just learning to see the world as it really is, not as people told you it should be. Grace did not answer. She stood there with the phone pressed to her ear, looking out at the city stretched beneath her. The 27-year-old girl who once dreamed of becoming a doctor, who once believed in good things, who once thought life had a clear line between right and wrong. That girl had disappeared a long time ago, and the woman standing on the balcony tonight, looking down at the city with eyes no longer innocent, did not know who she was anymore. But maybe that was not the most important thing. What mattered was that she was still here, still fighting, still protecting the people she loved. And maybe, for now, that was enough. 4 months passed like an autumn wind, carrying changes Grace never expected. The neighborhood was no longer the gray, fear-soaked place she had once known. Shops stood shoulder to shoulder now, their signs bright and new. Sidewalks had been repaved, smooth underfoot. Streetlights worked reliably, leaving no dark corners where thugs used to linger. Children ran and played in the streets after school, their laughter echoing through roads that had once been silent with fear. Grace became the bridge between Vincent and the community, a role she never imagined she would take on. Each week, she met Vincent at least once to report what was happening, to discuss new investment projects, to solve problems as they came up. The meetings that had begun tense and brief slowly grew easier. She started noticing small things about him that she had never paid attention to before. The way he always set his coffee cup on the left, the way his head tilted slightly when he was thinking, the way those deep black eyes softened when he talked about projects that helped the elderly in the neighborhood. Her mother left the hospital after 3 months of treatment, her recovery so strong the doctors called it a miracle. Eleanor Sullivan could walk on her own now, cook, and even start a little garden on the balcony of the new apartment Vincent had arranged for her. For the first time in years, Grace saw color in her mother's cheeks and light in her eyes when she smiled. One afternoon, when Grace came to visit, her mother sat on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hand, watching her daughter with an expression Grace could not read. "You see him a lot, don't you?" her mother asked, her voice gentle. Grace knew who she meant. "It's work, Mom. I have to report on the neighborhood." "Work." Her mother repeated the word, a faint smile touching her mouth. "Do you love him?" The question stopped Grace cold. The teacup in her hand nearly slipped. "What are you talking about? He's not the kind of man." "I'm not asking what kind of man he is." Eleanor looked at her daughter, eyes old but still sharp. "I'm asking whether you love him." Grace could not answer. She stood there with her heart pounding, wondering why a simple question could shake her so badly. The next evening, Vincent called and invited her to dinner. Not a work meeting, not a discussion about projects. "Just dinner," he said, his voice carrying a hesitation Grace had never heard from him before. Vincent's mansion looked different at night. Candlelight replaced the harsh brightness of overhead lamps, and the dining room felt small and warm instead of the wide, cold living spaces. The table was set for two, with simple Italian dishes prepared with quiet care. Vincent sat across from her, no suit jacket, none of the usual cold mask. Just a 36-year-old man with tired eyes and a rare, restrained smile. "Do you know why I asked you here tonight?" he asked after they had nearly finished eating. Grace shook her head. Vincent set his wineglass down and stared into the distance, as if searching for something he had lost a long time ago. "Today is Maria's birthday. My wife." He paused. She would have been 40 if she were still alive. Grace did not know what to say. She stayed still, waiting. "Maria was the only person who ever believed I could do something good," Vincent continued, his voice low and far away. "She met me when I already belonged to the underworld, when I already had blood on my hands, when I had done things that could not be forgiven. And she stayed anyway. She said the darkness doesn't define a man. What defines him is what he chooses to do in the darkness." He turned to look at Grace, and she saw something in those deep black eyes, something woven out of pain and hope together. "When Maria died, I thought the good part of me died with her. I had no reason to be anything except what I had always been. Until you came along, Grace felt her heart quicken. You saved me in that alley, not for money, not out of fear, not because you wanted something from me. You saved me because it was the right thing to do, Vincent said, his voice as light as breath. You showed me it's possible to do the right thing even in the dark. That kindness still exists, even in the darkest places. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the wild beat of Grace's heart. I don't know if I deserve your trust, Vincent said, his eyes never leaving hers. But I want you to know that for the first time in 10 years, I want to become a better man, because of you. Grace did not answer with words. She reached across the table and lightly touched his hand where it rested. A small touch, as soft as a butterfly's wing, but it carried everything she did not know how to say. Vincent looked down at her hand on his, and for the first time, Grace saw him smile. Not a cold smile, not a calculating one. The smile of a man who had just found something he thought he had lost forever. That night, nothing else happened. No kiss, no confession, only two people sitting together in candlelight, sharing the warm silence of souls slowly finding each other. And for Grace, that was enough. At least for now. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the night Grace Sullivan pulled a dying man into a bakery and changed her entire life. She stood at the edge of the riverside, the place where she and Vincent had met for the second time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sunset stained the water red, shimmering like scattered flakes of gold across the calm current. Vincent stood beside her, silent as a statue. Since Maria's birthday dinner, something between them had shifted in subtle ways. Nothing declared, no promises, no vows. But there was something in the way they looked at each other, in the silences they shared, in the way their hands brushed by accident and no one pulled away. I have something for you, Vincent said at last, breaking the quiet. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small key, silver and bright in the fading light, and placed it in Grace's palm. With the key came a thick envelope. Open it. Grace opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a stack of documents, and as she read, her heart seemed to stop. The deed to the apartment she was living in the name of Grace Sullivan. A savings account statement with a balance large enough for her to live comfortably for years. Lifetime medical insurance paperwork for her mother. An employment contract for Tommy at a legitimate construction company, with no ties to the underworld. Everything is legal, Vincent said, his voice calm. There's nothing connecting any of it to me or my organization. You can take these and leave. Start a new life. Forget me. Forget everything that happened. Grace looked up, confused. Why? Because you deserve a choice. Vincent looked out at the river, dark eyes reflecting the last glow of sunset. 6 months ago, you were dragged into my world without wanting it. You stayed because there was no other road, because your mother was sick, because your brother was drowning in debt, because your neighborhood was under threat. But now, all of that has been handled. He turned to her. You're free now, Grace. You can leave this world. Grace held the key, feeling the weight of cold metal. Freedom. She could walk away right now, go back to her apartment, pack a bag, disappear, start over in another city, with a new name, a new life. No mafia, no bargaining with criminals, no standing between two worlds. No, Vincent. She was silent for a long time, long enough for the sun to slip fully below the horizon and the sky to fade from red to purple to deep blue-black. Vincent stood there, patient, not pressing her. Do you know what I'm going to say? Grace finally asked, her voice light as wind. I hope. He paused. But I'm not sure. Grace turned to him. To the man who had changed everything in her life. The cold mafia boss who controlled half the city's underworld. A man with blood on his hands and a heart broken by the loss of his wife. But also the man who rebuilt her neighborhood, saved her mother, gave her brother a second chance, and looked at her as if she were the only light in his darkness. I'm not going anywhere, she said. But I have conditions. Vincent tilted his head slightly, waiting. First, no romance yet. Grace said it plainly, without embarrassment. I need time. That night on Maria's birthday, I don't regret what happened, but I need to know what I feel is real. Not because you saved my family, or because we've been through too much together. Vincent nodded, without a hint of objection. Second, I keep being the bridge between you and the neighborhood. Not because you pay me or because I owe you. Because I want to. Because it's the right thing. All right. Third. Grace looked straight into his eyes. If you want me to stay, you have to truly change. Not change for me. Change because you want to become better. I can't love a mafia boss, Vincent, but maybe I can love the man who's trying to climb out of the dark. Silence stretched out. The river kept flowing beneath them, and the first stars began to appear overhead. You're asking for too much, Vincent said at last. But there was no anger in his voice, only something close to admiration. I know. Every port. Vincent turned fully toward her, and in those deep black eyes Grace saw something she had never seen before. Not the cold calculation of a mafia boss, not the grief of a man who had lost his wife. Hope, pure and fragile. The hope of a man who had just found a reason to believe in tomorrow. Partners? He asked, holding out his hand. Grace looked at that hand. A hand that had killed, that had given brutal orders, but also the hand that had held hers on Maria's birthday, with a gentleness she never expected. She took it. Partners. 1 year after the fateful night in the dark alley, Grace Sullivan stood in front of the doors of her own bakery. A polished wooden sign with the name Sullivan's carved with careful detail hung above the clear glass entrance. Inside, the scent of fresh bread mingled with rich coffee, and the morning sun poured through the windows, laying warm golden streaks across the new wooden floor. This was not Morrison's bakery, where she had once worked for someone else. This was her dream, built with sweat, tears, and choices she never imagined she would have to make. Margaret stood behind the counter, hands moving quickly as she arranged croissants in the display tray. The woman who once looked at Grace with pure hatred now worked beside her every day, not for money, but because she had found a reason to keep living. Walter would be proud of us, she said each morning when they unlocked the door. And Grace understood that as forgiveness she never dared ask for, yet had been given anyway. Tommy pushed a supply cart through the doorway, his face sun-browned and his muscles firm after a year working for the construction company. The brother who had nearly lost his life to gambling now woke at 5 every morning, worked hard, and sent money to their mother each month. Need anything, sis? He asked, a smile on his face that no longer carried boyish innocence, but the steadiness of a man who had learned an expensive lesson. Her mother sat at the table by the window, where she liked to sit each morning and watch her daughter work. Eleanor Sullivan was no longer the frail, hollow woman confined to a hospital bed. She was well again, cheeks rosy, eyes bright, telling jokes to customers so often Grace had to remind her not to keep people waiting too long for their pastries. Outside the window, the neighborhood had changed completely. Shops lined the street with colorful signs. The sidewalks were clean, with flower pots placed along both sides. Children ran and played after school, their clear laughter echoing through streets that had once been drowned in fear. Harry opened a new bakery directly across the road, and the two of them often waved to each other every morning like old friends. The bell above the door rang, and Grace turned. Vincent walked in, no suit jacket, no bodyguards, just an ordinary man in a white shirt and jeans. He came once a week, always ordered a black coffee and a croissant, sat in his usual corner, and read the paper like any other customer. No one in the bakery dared to whisper his old titles anymore. To them, Vincent was no longer the monster they feared, but a man who had kept his word, a regular who always left generous tips and nodded hello with a gentle smile. Only Grace knew the truth, and she kept that secret the way she kept the apartment key he had once placed in her hand. Vincent stepped up to the counter. His dark eyes met her blue ones, and between them was something that did not need words. Over the past year, they had kept their agreement. No romance, only partners. Only two people building something larger than themselves. But in the way their eyes lingered, in the accidental brush of fingers when she handed him his coffee, in the late-night conversations that stretched on over the phone, they both knew it was only a matter of time. Partners? Vincent asked, holding out his hand the way he always did. Grace took his hand, feeling the familiar warmth. Partners. 18. That night, after the bakery was closed, Grace stood on her apartment balcony and looked down at the neighborhood as it slipped into night. Lights from shops, homes, and street lamps shimmered like fallen stars scattered across the ground. Children's laughter carried from the newly built playground. Soft music drifted from the corner cafe. Life, simple and ordinary, was moving forward the way it was always meant to. She thought about the night 1 year earlier, when she sat alone in a dark apartment, certain she had lost everything. She thought about the dying man in the alley, about the choice to open that door when every instinct told her to turn away. She thought about everything that came after. The losses, the pain, and also the miracles. Sometimes, one act of kindness can change everything. She had learned that the hardest way possible. Kindness does not always lead to good outcomes right away. Sometimes it brings suffering, loss, and choices you cannot take back. But if you hold on, If you keep believing, if you do not give up, kindness will find its way back. Grace smiled, for the first time in a long time, a smile without worry or fear attached to it. Only the quiet peace of someone who had finally found her place in the world. She did not know what the future would bring. She did not know where her relationship with Vincent would go. She did not know whether the darkness would someday return. But she knew one thing. Whatever happened, she would face it, with courage, with a heart still capable of love, with the same hands that had kneaded dough and baked bread, and also stitched wounds to save a life, because that was Grace Sullivan, the girl who stepped into darkness and found the light. This story gives us a profound lesson about the value of kindness and courage. In life, sometimes we are forced to make difficult choices, and not every choice leads to a good outcome immediately. But if we act from the heart, if we choose compassion instead of indifference, then no matter how rough the road becomes, the light will find its way home in the end. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share so more people can hear meaningful stories like this every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about Grace and Vincent's story. Would you make the same choice she did? In real life, have you ever had to face a hard decision where your kindness was tested? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We look forward to hearing the stories that come from the deepest parts of your hearts. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. Wishing everyone watching good health and a life filled with joy and peace each day. Always keep kindness in your heart, because you never know how one small act of yours might change someone else's life. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.